Hi, everyone. This is Galina Antova from Claroty, and you're listening to Manufacturing Happy Hour.
Welcome to Manufacturing Happy Hour, the podcast where we get real about the latest trends and technologies impacting modern manufacturers.
Manufacturing
Happy Hour. Each week, we interview industry experts that are at the top of their craft and give you the tools, tactics, and strategies you need to take your career and your business to the next level. And now, your host, Chris Lukey.
What's up, folks? Welcome to episode 20. Today, we're going to be jumping back into the topic of cybersecurity, but to be honest, this episode is stacked, and that's just one area that we're going to be covering. The reason is we have a fantastic guest today. Her name is Galina Antova, and she is the co-founder of Claroty, a company that is focused on security for OT, otherwise known as operations technology. Not too long ago, we finished doing our 4-part cybersecurity miniseries with Rockwell Automation, and you all were asking for more content around cybersecurity, and there is no one better than Galina to bring that type of information to the show. But I said we'd cover more ground than just that, so what are the 3 things you can expect from today's episode? Well, first, we are going to jump into the security topic. We're going to go into what Claroty does, define some important terms like critical infrastructure, discuss why right now is the perfect storm for OT cybersecurity, and why IT tools should not be used for operations technology security. Second, we're going to cover the startup story behind Claroty. Galina will share where she saw the need, we'll cover the unique story about her and her co-founders, and how to lead through not only rapid growth, but uncertain times as well. Finally, we'll talk about empowering underrepresented voices in industry. From Galina's experiences as a female leader in a male-dominated space to much larger topics that impact not just this industry, but society as a whole, Galina shares some powerful examples and actionable advice to bring about real change in manufacturing and beyond. Like many of our most dynamic episodes, this one is full of resources. If you'd like to connect with Claroty, first, you can go to claroty.com. Let me make sure I'm clear, no pun intended. Claroty is spelled C-L-A-R-O-T-Y, just like they're an operations technology company. So C-L-A-R-O-T-Y. That is also their handle at Twitter, so just at Claroty on Twitter if you want to follow them on social media. But as an overall repository for all the resources mentioned today, you can just go to manufacturinghappyhour.com/20 to access everything mentioned in this episode. On a related topic, if you are enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review over at iTunes. It's very easy. You just hit that 5-star button, or you can write a review that is as short as 1 sentence long. It does not need to be complicated. You can go to manufacturinghappyhour.com/iTunes to be taken directly to the Apple Podcasts platform on your iPhone or on your computer. All right, I mentioned we have a lot of ground to cover today, so let's not spend any more time here on this introduction. I'm excited to get you introduced to Galina for today's interview. All right, our guest today is the co-founder of Claroty, a company that has quickly risen as a leader in cybersecurity for critical infrastructure for operations technology networks. She's worked with some of the biggest names in security across the globe and is a change maker in an industry that has long been overdue for advancement. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome security savant, Galina Antova. Galina, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Excited to have you here. Excited to get to feature Claroty on the show because I've heard a ton about you as someone that works at Rockwell, but just being in the manufacturing industry in general. And in the spirit of manufacturing happy hour, we always want to start off in, what I'd say is a casual fashion. So let's say, we're at a trade show and we're at the social hour after the trade show is the hours have wrapped up for the day. And someone comes up to you and is like, Galina, I know that Claroty works in critical infrastructure. You're doing operations technology, security for operations technology in that space. But what does that really mean? How do you explain it to them if you're, at a happy hour having a drink with them?
Great question. So I would usually start with a joke along the lines of, well, the world actually runs on operational technology networks, and this is what we're securing. But really, jokes aside, this is just, I think, a topic that we don't talk about a lot, and that's the fact that there's a lot of conversation around IT security, which is basically the protection and the monitoring of all of our digital infrastructure when it comes to the regular IT networks in the enterprise. But if we think about the operational technology networks, or the networks that actually are connecting all the devices related to physical processes, every single company in the world has a component of operational technology networks. Some are more critical than others. So, for example, in things like manufacturing and oil and gas and electric utilities, obviously the operational technology networks are the backbone of the business. But even if you're just a company that has nothing to do with manufacturing, you still have offices that have building management systems and HVAC and elevators, and really anything that touches a physical infrastructure, physical process in the world has a component of operational technology networks. And the reason I'm so passionate about that is because it's also, OT has been such a huge blind spot for security teams, right? So traditionally, those devices are lots of them are legacy devices built to be out there in the field for 25, 35, sometimes 45 years.
Yeah.
And so that makes them very challenging to protect. Now, combine that with many attack vectors that we're seeing nowadays, a lot of them actually introduced more recently because of the COVID crisis, right? So a lot of remote connectivity. And obviously combining that with the very opportunistic adversaries that are realizing the importance of those networks, and therefore they understand that they're valuable, we kind of find ourselves in that perfect storm where we don't have enough visibility into those networks. We're expected to protect them, and the adversary has realized that they're very valuable. So as an industry, this is kind of where we are right now in terms of the I would say the risk posture of those networks. I'd say that there's at least 25 years of a gap between the risk posture of IT and OT networks, and this is largely because of the points that I mentioned. Now, going forward, we don't have 25 years to address that gap, right? So part of what Claroty does, and part of what I've dedicated the last almost 9 years of my life, first with Siemens and now with Claroty, is thinking through how can we accelerate that path of closing those security gaps in OT, so that we can have a more holistic governance and risk reduction across the whole organization.
A lot of great information there. A couple areas on that I'd love to get some more definition so I can make sure our listeners capture some of the most critical points. One thing that really jumped out in that was you mentioned, not only that it's been a 25-year gap before we've seen some updates, so there's definitely a need for immediate improvement, but why is right now, as you described it, the perfect storm?
A lot of it has to do with the additional attack vectors. So so it's challenging enough for a company, a regular company, to just kind of take all of their employees, have them work remotely. Obviously, that introduces a lot of challenges. Now, if you think that you also have to do that to some or all of your OT engineers that are actually physically in those physical processes, interacting with the HMIs and the controllers that are driving the physical process, that makes it that much more complicated. I mean, think about doing remote maintenance or changing the programming of a controller completely from a remote, completely to remote work. That obviously requires a very different security. It requires different cyber posture. Securing everything from the end devices to the communication. So it just introduces quite a lot of complexity into that. Now, what's even more interesting is that it's not just COVID. It's not like COVID's going to happen and we're going to go back to quote unquote what we considered normal. I think that as painful as the current situation is, it is also given a lot of people the realization that had we invested more time and implementation up front to ensure that infrastructure is more distributed and some of those remote access connectivity is enabled and secure, our life would not only be much easier now, but we could also capture quite a lot of productivity gains and many other gains that come with digital transformation projects. So one of the silver linings that I've discovered through my conversations with chief information security officers and many OT engineers is that now they understand across the whole organization, their peers, the board understand the value of those digital transformation projects. And so I expect for us to see a lot greater acceptance of those projects and a greater acceleration going forward.
So if I heard that right around the perfect storm, there's this multiplier effect. You take the criticality of some of these processes, and then you add the fact that you're logging in remotely and you're making these type of changes, and it all kind of adds up to make it that much more of an issue. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you have to add to that the threat landscape, right? So obviously, adversaries are very opportunistic. They don't care about, to the adversary, a network is a network. They don't care if you're labeling it an IT, OT, doesn't really matter. They're starting to realize that your critical infrastructure, your OT networks are extremely valuable because obviously, in many cases, they affect the bottom line. And therefore, if they're critical to your operations, that means that they're valuable to you. And so things like ransomware, et cetera, are activities that we expect to see increasing very much in the future. And one other thing that I like to point out, Chris, we are kind of judging the situation by the very few incidents and data points that we have. Again, I'd like to go back to my opening where I said that OT networks still remain pretty much a black box to the security organizations of many companies. And that is due to the fact that they don't even have, in many cases, the basic security tools to allow us to monitor them, et cetera. So it's kind of like there's a saying that I say often, which is, the absence of evidence is not evidence for the absence of the attackers on those networks, right? So we're just kind of seeing the tip of the iceberg, I believe, when it comes to what actually is going on in these networks. And as we deploy more technologies to gain visibility and to be able to monitor those networks, I think that we'll discover a lot more adversarial activities.
Great, I guess, being clarification and emphasis around the type of adversaries that are out there and how those play into that. Let's go back to the trade show happy hour really quickly. You were talking about how, there's this black box to operations technology networks, and that they're, I always think of something when I think of cybersecurity. Someone might say, hey, Galina, why can't I use like IT approaches to my OT cybersecurity? How does that play into this? How would you answer that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can talk about that for hours, but basically, we're dealing with very different endpoints, right? So first of all, as I mentioned, we're dealing with legacy devices that are in many cases real-time machines. So something like a PLC, programmable logic controller, that is actually physically like running or commanding, so to speak, telling the physical process what to do. It's a real-time machine, and so it's much more sensitive to other technologies being installed on that device. You're dealing with a lot of proprietary protocols, so it's not like in the IT domain where you can just have any IT security technology that is able to dissect the traffic. In OT networks, every single vendor has their own proprietary protocol. And so if you want to be able to examine the network communication, the traffic, you need to basically build your own quote unquote translators for those protocols. And that's a huge burden because no customer has only one OEM, right? So like the customers have various different OEMs, equipment manufacturers in their environments. And so that just kind of puts a very high threshold. Obviously, we've got latencies issues on the networks. We've got extreme complexity. And in general, we have an environment where, because of the legacy nature of the devices, many of the activities that we consider very simple in IT, something like an active scan to determine what assets you have on your network, this is something that could literally bring down the OT network. And so the requirements of uptime and availability are very different. The nature of the endpoints that we're dealing with is very different, and that requires a very different approach. Now, what I always say is that the outcome is always the same. We're looking for risk reduction. But the core security controls that we're going to use to implement would have to be, technologies that do not impact the uptime and availability of those networks, and B, actually understand the proprietary languages they speak on. And the silver lining to that, I think these are all kind of negative aspects in terms of like how complex things are. But the positive aspect to all of that is we're starting from scratch. There literally are very few to none security technologies already deployed in operational technology. And so we can take advantage of that. And instead of having to put together, 15, 20 security tools and take 3 years to do a segmentation project the way we have in the IT domain, we can really think from scratch as to can, one technology, for example, satisfy multiple use cases. And again, look for technologies that are natively built for those OT networks and that satisfy many of those core security controls, many of those use cases, so that you're going with something that is simplified to begin with and you're not adding that complexity from the IT. So yeah, basically to summarize, copying pasting technologies from the IT just doesn't work. Best case scenario is going to do nothing, but the more common case is actually that it negatively impacts those networks. And so we need to be very, very careful in how we implement that. And by the way, this is where a lot of the traditional I would say challenges of IT and OT teams working together come from. They come from the fact that, a few years ago, IT really we tried to kind of impose those before the industry matured. We saw a lot of IT security team trying to impose IT practices to OT, and that of course backfired because the end result will be reduced uptime and availability and a lot of issues in those OT networks. But now we're at a more advanced state of the industry where we've got the right tools and we've got the right approaches. We just need to be very careful in how we apply them.
Awesome answer. I love the parallel between, the challenges and the opportunities and it's interesting because we talk about digital transformation a lot on this show also. And the challenges seem to be similar, where that it's you have this older equipment, you have such a variety of equipment. There's not necessarily a standard between there like you might see in more of a traditional IT environment. And I think what you were saying kind of feeds into our next question around where there's kind of this blank slate. And you've had an illustrious career up until starting Claroty. You were with Intel, you were with Siemens, as you've mentioned. So why did you start Claroty then? I'm curious if it has anything to do with that last answer around that blank slate.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. So when I was early in my career, I was with IBM in just the pure, IT, software development, security kind of different roles, technical roles, management roles. Haven't even heard of the fact that operational technology networks around the world, had no idea what that is. And so I had an opportunity after my MBA to be recruited for like one of the most senior kind of executive programs at Siemens, where that gave us an opportunity to look across the whole Siemens portfolio and to think about what are new businesses that could be started out of that. And so that was 9 years ago. This was when we had just started seeing the first cyber physical attacks on critical infrastructure using software weapons, so to speak. And so when I came to Siemens and got introduced to this whole wonderful world of operational technology, and pretty quickly understood that this is actually what makes the physical world run. And then realizing all the challenges associated with it, all the things that we mentioned, legacy devices, proprietary protocols, etc. And then I said, well, for sure, the security companies, the existing cybersecurity companies must be doing something about this. This is just such a gigantic field of opportunity. And I was very surprised to find out that they weren't. So basically what I did at Siemens for a number of years is to put together the industrial security services. This was a completely new business segment that we built from scratch, which was helping Siemens customers overcome some of those challenges related to their industrial security protection. And just in the course of that discovery, it became pretty clear that the technical tools, right, from a process and governance perspective, were getting pretty advanced. but the actual technology that will help us to be much more effective in monitoring those networks, in making those networks visible, that work was not being done, and it was not being done by the large security companies. And so this is kind of what gave me the idea for Claroty and gave me I would say, the courage to leave my crucial executive job at Siemens and to make that jump and start a new company.
Well, a couple things that I find interesting about that, any good startup story always seems to involve addressing a big problem. And the way you described it is, the systems that make the world run, there was a gap there. You didn't see that, holistic security strategy around it. So it gave you an opportunity to start Claroty. One thing that I found really interesting when I look at Claroty's origin story is you actually co-founded it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like you co-founded it with Unit 8200 of like the Israeli Military Intelligence Corps, that's like responsible for code decryption and signal intelligence. And you also went through a Teammate Foundry, I think, in Israel as well. Where does that connection come from? I'm curious, because that's very unique from what I've seen from most folks we've talked about.
Yeah, exactly. It's not exactly with the government, but rather my two co-founders, they come from the IDF and from that organization, and so it's not a secret that Israel is just excellent at creating a lot of cybersecurity talent. They have one of the most advanced programs in the world, and there's just the way the program is structured, they just got a lot of cybersecurity talent. This is why they have such an amazing, thriving ecosystem. And so when I thought of who are the kind of the technical co-founders that I want to work with, Israel was definitely top of my list, and through common connections, I found my way to my two co-founders. And then, of course, that was in the context of Teammate, which is a cybersecurity foundry that is led by Nadav Zafrir, who's he's the former director of Unit 8200. So that's another connection. But really, that's just folks that have been on the front lines of cybersecurity, and so having my perspective on the business opportunity with my kind of technical background and understanding the possibility, and with them being on the front lines, that was just a perfect combination. And being part of the accelerator also, we were pretty clear, the need was pretty clear in my mind, that we didn't have to go through a lot of market product fit iterations, because this is what I've been doing at Siemens for the last few years, is just kind of talking to so many customers and partners. It was pretty clear what we needed to build, and very quickly we got funding and we got going. So now, more than 5.5 years later, we're almost 200 people company. We've raised $100 million from many of the strategic investors around the world, including Rockwell, by the way. And so we're very fortunate to have to be serving many of the Fortune 500 customers around the world. I think nowadays our footprint is in about 17 different industry verticals in over 50 countries. So that's just a testament to the need for such operational technology cybersecurity solutions, and we're very proud of the progress we've had to date.
We'll be right back right after a word from our sponsor. This episode of Manufacturing Happy Hour is sponsored by Audible. Audible is the world's largest electronic library of audiobooks and spoken word entertainment. And because you listen to this amazing podcast, we're giving you one free audiobook when you sign up for your first trial of Audible. You can do that by going to audibletrial.com/happyhourpod. Now, why would you want to do such a thing? Well, let's be honest, these podcasts only last about 30 minutes to an hour, but audiobooks give you much more listening pleasure beyond that. So when you wrap up your episode of Manufacturing Happy Hour, you can tune in to the audiobook of your choosing on Audible. You get a new credit every month, so that's a new book a month. And for me, that's where I get my leadership books, that's where I get my non-leadership books, that's where I get my rock and roll books, that's where I get my fiction. Anything I want to read, typically, I'm going to Audible to get it. Again, you can claim your free audiobook by going to audibletrial.com/happyhourpod. And now, let's get back to today's episode. Well, from what I've heard about Claroty, you've had just rapid growth. Like you just said, you're at 200 people already. In fact, I think I heard in one of your other interviews, you grew 300% year over year one time. And how do you manage that type of exponential growth as a startup, especially when you're serving so many very large companies like Rockwell Automation that, tend to move? Let's be honest, it's no secret that a large company moves slower than a startup does. How have you managed that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, this is just where our passion happened to be, but from all of the different kind of choices, we chose the hardest one. So it's a very heavy B2B model. We're dealing with a lot of the largest organizations in the world, which, as you mentioned, from an admin perspective, sometimes things are moving very, very slowly. We're working in a very traditional domain of industrial operations, trying to bring cybersecurity to that. So it was very challenging, I would say, conceptually. But actually, once we hit the ground running with a product and we started putting that product in everyone's hands, it was just the response from the customer was basically overwhelming. This is exactly what we need. This is giving us all the visibility and the monitoring and the protection. And so that response and that rapid adoption from the customers was what really allowed us to move very, very fast. Now, irrespective of all of that, it's still very challenging to scale a startup. Like, you're going basically from doing one-on-one sales, the founder selling, to building a whole sales organization. So obviously that has been challenging, but I think that the product market fit spoke for itself. And there was just this great gap that we were fulfilling between the world moving so fast on the IT side and the world wanting especially to get into those digital transformation projects that required a lot of connectivity. They required a lot of distributed kind of infrastructure, whereas the OT networks were very much like trying to still be isolated. And so we allowed them to get to that new stage of gaining the visibility, gaining the monitoring capabilities, and being able to bring their OT networks into the 21st century, so to speak.
One thing I always find interesting about startups, you mentioned that there was just tremendous product market fit with your solution. Can you maybe go into that a bit more? Because it's not... I think a lot of startup founders, and this is coming from someone in the Bay Area, often have that build it and they will come mentality, and that's not always the case. I'd love to hear, how did you go about getting some of your first clients in this space?
So, I mean, you're seeing what I'm sharing about Claroty is you're just kind of seeing the end result of the product market fit, right? So I think that, and it's very different between consumer tech and B2B, right? So for something, most of the successful startups and, friends that I have in that area that are dealing with like hard enterprise problems, those usually, the solutions to those, the inspiration for solutions to those came because those founders had been they have been intimately acquainted with the situation. They've been experiencing the problems themselves. They've seen the need firsthand, just like I saw that by working with a lot of the Siemens customers, by working with a lot of the Siemens partners. For something like a B2B, large enterprise play, you have to see that problem in the wild, so to speak, and experience it for some time before you can start forming your thesis. I think with consumer, you can rely a little bit more on your human intuition for a lot of things, and you can just test things. And so I think that for a lot of the successful B2B companies, the outcome that you're seeing in the initial market product fit is actually the end result of years and years of being in another field, and actually, in the same field actually, but looking at problems and just kind of formulating a thesis. So it's a little bit misleading in that sense, because knowing what to build came from a lot of experiences that I've had before deciding to start Claroty. But you're absolutely right, especially for like selling to large enterprises, you really need to hit on the exact need, and you need to also do that in a way that eliminates a lot of traction from the process. So I'll give you one example. There have been other security technologies on the market that are trying to address operational technology networks, but most of them had required something along the lines of like, I don't know, I have to deploy something, some physical gadget or device in front of every single PLC. Thinking through where the technology is actually deployed and how much time would it require for the customer team to actually implement that technology is extremely important. What we did in the case of Claroty to eliminate a lot of that friction was actually to read the network traffic. So our touch point with the networks was much fewer points. And so by just reading the traffic, we were able to identify assets, to put together the communication patterns, etc. But in terms of what that meant for the customer team, we weren't asking them for months and months of their time. We were just asking them for a couple of hours to set it up. And so I think that's one very important thing to consider when you're dealing with enterprise customers.
Great points around kind of the differences between B2B and B2C when it comes from starting a company.
Yeah.
One thing that also comes to mind, because we talked about your rapid growth, but now, managing rapid growth is one thing. The other thing I'm curious about is right now we're recording this in June 2020, and we're in a very crazy time period, to say the least. So on the flip side of managing through growth, how do you lead through times of uncertainty like we're having right now?
Yeah, I mean, it all starts with communication. So the reality is that at the beginning of this, and even now, no one's got a crystal ball and no one knows exactly how things are going to develop. It was extremely important for us to, first of all, communicate to employees, make sure that employees are okay and they're safe and they can work safely. There are obviously a lot of mental health issues that come along the way as well. And those just need to be, there needs to be the support system for that, because so much of what has happened in the last 3 months in terms of like the mental health and support, we take that for granted, but it's not. We work in very stressful environments now, especially for those that have young kids, etc. So the environment has changed a lot. It was extremely important to communicate and to make sure, first of all, that the team is okay, right? So people come first. The second one was obviously every company in this environment was worried about their revenue flow, right? And the reality is that a lot of deals had to be pushed just because the security teams were busy with making sure that the infrastructure is up and running and that the organizations are protected. And just obviously because of the financial uncertainty, some projects got pushed. What was really important for us is to think through how we can help our customers through that period of time, right? So could we give them better financial terms? Could we give them additional support? So it really, the relationship with a customer came first rather than just, pushing a deal down the road. And at the same time, it was also an opportunity for us to kind of think creatively of, given that now the world is going this way, right? And it's never completely gonna come back to what we considered normal before that. What are the opportunities we can take advantage of? So one thing is we had a component of our system, which was a secure remote access component, which was, in many cases secondary to the way we were selling the Claroty platform. Obviously, during COVID-19, that became a very core component of how we were selling, and that became an aspect of the offering that we're highlighting. So, going forward, we're identifying those opportunities that basically would allow our customers to undergo that digital transformation even faster, right? So now that they've seen that this is a possibility and that it could be done, and that it's not just a defensive move, but it actually provides them with opportunities for growth. So digital transformation is a competitive advantage. What are the ways in which we can push the market and push our product in a way that gets them closer to that end state? So lots of new opportunities and lots of new ideas for the product development direction.
It's becoming a great, I don't want to say I'm hearing a formula to this, but from some of this and other interviews we've done over the past couple months, it seems like communication is number one, both internally and externally with your customers. And then, yes, being focused on the revenue, making sure the business is healthy, but putting more of the focus on how can we help right now with that long-term perspective, like you were wrapping up there with, to prepare these people to execute quicker in the future as things improve.
Yeah, very important, because those are relationships that you want to have, for years and years to come. This is not transactional business, especially when it comes to B2B. So you want to make sure that you're really there for your customers, not just, one of the things I used to tell the team is just we don't have to make statements. We don't have to send emails telling our customers how much we support them. Let's just go and do something for them to support them, and they'll see the results, right? So actions speak louder than words, for sure.
Love that. Love that. Well, you've given us a lot of great info around cybersecurity in general, as well as Claroty's specific story. As we get to the final portions of the interview, another area that I've come across in other interviews I've seen you do is your focus on diversity and advancing women in the workforce. And, it's no secret that security and tech in general have long time been male dominated areas. And while we're seeing improvements, I'd love to hear some of your perspectives around, what are the challenges that we're still seeing out there, and how have you overcome those to become the successful leader that you are in this space?
Yeah, I mean, so much that I can say about this topic, but let me start by acknowledging, first of all, that we live in crazy times, and crazy in the sense that I think a lot of those inequalities and injustices are coming to the surface, and they need to be addressed, right? So each of us individually needs to think about what can we do to address those, but just to go by the numbers, and I don't have the perfect statistics in my head, but we can grab those after the podcast. If you just look at I think it comes down to the fact that the world's population is not represented in the power structures, period. And so that applies to women. So very much, my experiences and what I've fought for throughout my professional career. That applies to race, that applies to everything you could imagine, whichever way you want to slice and dice humans. That applies to basically all of those criteria. And so the world is not represented. We don't have the power. A lot of people feel that like they don't have the power. And if you look at the numbers, it's very, very clear. Look at the number of female CEOs at the Fortune 500 companies. I think last time I looked at the statistics, it was maybe 20, and I might be off by a few, but I think it's around that, or maybe even less. And the one thing that stuck with me is that there were more leaders called John or Dave, again, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, that there were women in total, right?
No way. Wow. That's such a telling statistic. Yeah.
We should go and look up that statistics, and I'm sorry that I'm forgetting the exact number, but it was just so telling. So you look at boards, and obviously that governs business across the board. You look at C-level executive management, and again, that tells you a story. It was very telling in the last few days as companies kind of started putting statements a lot around diversity and Black Lives Matter and all that. Many people just questioned them. Okay, in addition to that statement, just put next to your statement a picture of your board and a picture of your C-level.
Ooh.
And then tell me, what are you doing for diversity, right? Of course, we all condemn racism and all that, but what are you concretely, right? So like the real world is a lot more subtle. And I understand, look, I judge from my experiences of being a woman in technology, especially in cybersecurity, especially in something as hardcore as operational technology, cybersecurity. I understand that a lot of times people don't mean to offend. I've had probably hundreds, if not thousands, of interactions where well-intentioned, white males in like 99% of the cases would say something just because they're uninformed, or because they just haven't thought about it, because they have this bias that is completely unconscious. But that's not a justification, right? So the fact that you are not aware or not educated is not a justification. And so in my very little ways in which I could impact that, I have started, 100% of the time just bringing very gently and respectfully those biases to the surface, and just calling them out in a respectful way, because that's exactly what a bias, looks like. Everything from if someone doesn't know me or doesn't know that as we're meeting, doesn't know of my background, if I'm walking into the room with my male colleague, 100% of the cases, they would assume that I work for my male colleague, even though it's, 100% the opposite. So just very, very, very small things like that, which, they're small if taken individually, but when they're put together, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And then obviously I can't even imagine what that means if we extrapolate to, communities that are affected by racism and all of those different things. But I just think in general, this is where a lot of the frustration in the world comes from, that we're not represented in the power structures. And I wrote an article or that saying that we basically will never have true equality until we have power. And so here's the tricky part. Power is not something that you can just go and take. I mean, short of a revolution and a war, which hopefully we're not going to get to that. But power also, you need to be invited to power. So this is where a lot of the people that are already in power, especially across the business community, they have a responsibility to invite, underrepresented minorities and just people who are not represented in the power structures. They have that obligation because of their leadership position to invite those people so that their voices are heard. And I hear a lot of times the conversation is, well, we want to give the job to the best person. And of course, this should be the case. This doesn't argue for giving the job to someone who's not qualified, but there are just so many candidates that are qualified, but they're just not looked at because they don't fit some kind of a subconscious bias or subconscious profile that we have in our mind. So, from like at my own personal level, what I can do is I can identify that bias and call it out. But oh my God, we're just at the baby steps at the very beginning of addressing this inequality and injustice, and it's gonna take a really long time.
Incredible points all around, and you're right. We could do a podcast just on this topic alone, no doubt. You addressed a lot of very important things in there. Unconscious bias, the macro issues where there are underrepresented groups that don't have that power, and inviting those people to power is very important around that. If I look at this situation, one thing that I'm hoping is going to improve moving forward is people are starting to recognize that there are just some things that, and I'll pick on myself as a male ally. I will have never experienced what it's like to be a person of color in the world or a female in the industry or whatever that is. But I hope more people are out there realizing that and being like, I'm listening and I want to know what can I do to learn to be a part of that solution. And I'd love it if you could extrapolate on that, inviting more people to the table type example a little bit more. Like because we have a lot of women that listen to this show. We also have a lot of male allies that listen to this show. I'm curious, what are the steps we can be taking as individuals or as companies to level the playing field, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to people in power inviting other people to the table and just really having that conversation. I would say, for anyone who's been privileged from whatever perspective, I just think if there's something that is so important that other people are deciding to go and protest, for example, and if you don't think that exists in the world, then you should ask yourself, well, what is kind of like the little bubble that I'm living in, and what are some of the resources that I could read on, or how do I get myself educated, right? So that's more of like, if you're in a position of power, think about how to make that power representative of the world and who are the people that you have to invite to the table. When it comes to all of us at a very individual level, again, my own example is I've started calling out unconscious bias, even if that is very uncomfortable. It's just really important to call it out and label it so that we can start identifying those blind spots that we have. That's the only way to move the conversation forward in a respectful way.
Awesome advice, Galina. And I'm going to talk to the audience here really quickly. So this is every week when I do this show, I give you folks out there a call to action. My call to action this week isn't to, go download a link or go leave a 5-star review for the podcast. My call to action for you is to do what Galina just said. Call out unconscious bias where you see that in your conversations. And I'll echo that again as I do the outro later, but that's as much of a challenge for you guys as it is for me. It's uncomfortable. If there's one thing I've learned over these past weeks, or I should say just the past week in general, is it's that we will make mistakes with these conversations as we go through it, but it's important to do that and learn from that, because if people are afraid to have those conversations, it's not going to get better.
Absolutely.
I love that advice. You mentioned, reading up resources, whether it's related to leadership or unconscious bias or any of the topics we have today. Do you have any resources you'd recommend for the audience, Galina, to dive into afterwards?
Sure. I have a couple of those, and I'll be happy to send you the links after the show so you can share them with the listeners.
Perfect. All right. Well, Galina, I really appreciate you taking us through such an insightful conversation today, covering a broad spectrum of topics from security to startups to empowering those in the workforce. This was great. I really appreciate you jumping on the show. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. And for those of you listening, we'll catch you again next time. Hey, thanks for listening. That was a powerful episode. A lot went into that, so much so that I actually have a few more resources to mention to you now that the actual interview is completed. First, when Galina was mentioning that part where the number of CEOs or leaders named John and David outnumbered the amount of leaders that were female, there's a link to an article that she wrote that included that. The article is titled, "It's Time to Stand with Women in Power." I will be linking to that in the show notes page at manufacturinghappyhour.com/20. In addition, for some actionable reading, I should say, after this interview, I do have some recommendations that Galina sent me later regarding books on women's empowerment in industry or in the workplace in general, as well as some leadership books. So the three books are, first is The Confidence Code, The Science and Art of Self-Assurance, What Women Should Know by Katie Kay. The second book is called Playing Big, Practical Wisdom for Women Who Want to Speak Up, Create, and Lead. This is written by Tara Moore. And then the last one is called Presence, Bringing Your Boldest Self to Your Biggest Challenges by Amy Cuddy. I would recommend that anyone listening to this show, whether you identify as a woman, an ally, whomever you may be, check them out. This is probably a good time to mention our sponsor again for today's episode, Audible. You can find audiobooks for, I believe, all three of these. Yeah, it looks like all three of these are audiobooks that you can check out. And you can claim one for free when you go to audibletrial.com/happyhourpod. Thanks a ton, Audible, for sponsoring today's episode. Now, I mentioned that all resources are at manufacturinghappyhour.com/20, and that my only call to action to you at this point would be to call out unconscious bias when you see it. No web links to go to for this. This is just actions that I feel we all should be taking in the workplace or in our daily lives when we encounter these type of issues. Whether you pick up any of these books or find ways to start taking action in your daily life, if you would like to join a group where you can take part in discussions about this on a regular basis, consider joining our Manufacturing Happy Hour industry community on LinkedIn. You can get there by going to manufacturinghappyhour.com/community. I know I said I wouldn't give out any more links, but this is related to that last topic if you want to be a part of the conversation somewhere online as well. So with that, that's it for this week. I hope we all go out and do our part to bring about change in our industry and our lives and our world in general. With that, we got more episodes coming your way soon. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. Stay innovative, stay thirsty, and we'll catch you back here on Manufacturing Happy Hour real soon. Cheers!
Thanks for listening to Manufacturing Happy Hour. Powered by the Industrial Network.